Maybe you know the Armenian Genocide happened. 1915, Ottoman Empire. Up to 1.5 million Armenians killed. First genocide of the 20th century. What you may not have known is everything else. Who actually did it? Because it wasn't just the Ottoman government. Who watched and said nothing? What they did specifically to women. What happened to the children who survived, and what Turkey has been doing ever since. The standard telling goes like this. The Ottoman Empire, led by a group called the Committee of Union and Progress, the Young Turks, ordered the deportation and extermination of the Armenian people beginning in 1915. That's true, but it's incomplete. The perpetrators were wider than the government that ordered it, and naming them matters because diffuse responsibility is how atrocities get denied. The killings near the front lines were carried out by a paramilitary unit called the Special Organization, convicts released from prison specifically to carry out massacres. The deportation convoys were escorted by gendarmes and local militias. In many regions, Kurdish tribal forces, organized by the Ottomans into an auxiliary cavalry called the Hamidiye, participated in the killings and seizure of Armenian land and property. The history is complicated. Historian Raymond Kevorkian argues that the role of Kurds has sometimes been overstated by Turkish historians eager to shift blame away from the state. Many settled Kurdish communities did not participate, but nomadic Kurdish tribes in certain regions actively did, and that is documented. There were also Circassian and Chechen fighters from the Caucasus involved in some areas, men who had their own history of conflict with Russians and sometimes transferred that hostility onto Armenians they associated with Russian interests. And then there were ordinary local people, neighbors, people who looted Armenian homes while their owners were being deported, who took Armenian land, livestock, and businesses because the state had effectively said, "Take it, it's yours now." The genocide was organized from the top, but it was carried out from the bottom up by thousands of people who made individual choices to participate. That's not an abstraction. That's how genocide works. It requires more cooperation than any government can manufacture alone. The Armenian Genocide didn't happen in secret. The denial machine depends on the idea that it was hidden, that the world didn't know, couldn't have known, couldn't have intervened, but that's untrue. The United States had diplomats in the region filing detailed reports. Henry Morgenthau Sr., the American ambassador to the Ottoman Empire, communicated directly with Talat Pasha, one of the primary architects of the genocide, and sent urgent cables to Washington describing what was happening in explicit terms. He was told, in effect, that there was nothing to be done. Germany was a military ally of the Ottoman Empire. Approximately 800 German officers and 25,000 soldiers were deployed alongside the Ottoman army. Individual German military advisors signed some of the orders that contributed to the deportations. The German Foreign Office received detailed reports from its own diplomats, including Heinrich Bergfeld, the German consul to Trebizond, who reported the rapes and killings and described them explicitly as part of a plan for the extermination of the Armenians. Germany's foreign minister and Ministry of War have both been described by historians as showing what one scholar called extreme moral indifference to what their own diplomats were reporting. They had the military power to intervene. They did not have the political desire to do so. The German president Joachim Gauck said in 2015 that Germans were not spectators. They were, in his words, active perpetrators of this crime. This matters because the Armenian Genocide is sometimes treated as a regional tragedy, an Ottoman internal affair, something that happened far away with minimal international implication. But powerful nations knew. Powerful nations had the ability to intervene, but they chose not to. That choice had consequences that reached far beyond Armenia. And I haven't fully sat with the implications and meaning of this, but Henry Morgenthau wasn't just an American ambassador. He was from a German Jewish family and cried out that this genocide was occurring, saying, "I am confident that the whole history of the human race contains no such horrible episode as this." He died in 1946, not long after his native Germany had committed the most systematically atrocious genocide of the 20th century that specifically targeted Jews like him and his family in large part. The systematic targeting of women during the Armenian Genocide was not incidental. It was structural. It was part of the plan. Armenian men were typically killed first at the beginning of deportations. shot or bayoneted in groups near their villages. What remained were women, children, and the elderly, and they were marched into the Syrian desert on what were called deportation convoys, but which were, in practical terms, death marches designed to finish what the massacres had started. During those marches, women were subjected to systematic sexual assault, not opportunistic violence, systematic. Ottoman soldiers, gendarmes, Kurdish tribesmen, and local civilians all participated. Young girls were disproportionately targeted. Women were abducted from the convoys and sold, taken into households as forced servants or forced wives, or taken to what can only be described as established in the Syrian desert regions of Ras Alan and Deir ez-Zor. This was witnessed, documented, and reported in real time by foreign diplomats and missionaries. This was also a tool of erasure in a very specific sense. Women who were impregnated were forced to raise children who would be absorbed into Turkish or Kurdish society, children who would not know they were Armenian, who would not carry Armenian names, who would not speak Armenian, who would not know their own history. The biological destruction of a people carried out through the bodies of their women. Many Armenian women faced a choice: suicide, which the historical record shows many chose, or survival under conditions that included forced conversion to Islam, forced marriages to the men who had just killed their families, and the erasure of everything that had defined their identity. Some of them told their children in secret, whispered to them at night that they were Armenian, that they were Christian, that they should remember. Some of those children remembered. Up to 200,000 Armenian women and children survived the genocide by being forcibly assimilated into Turkish and Kurdish communities. Tens of thousands of Armenian children were taken from their families or from the bodies of their families, renamed, given Muslim names, converted to Islam, and raised with no knowledge of who they were. Boys were taken as forced laborers. Girls were taken as servants, as forced brides, as children adopted into households that had sometimes participated in killing their parents. The Ottoman state had a specific policy. Armenians who converted to Islam could sometimes avoid deportation, but only if they did not constitute more than 5 to 10% of the local population. Above that threshold, even conversion wasn't enough. The goal was not conversion. The goal was elimination. Conversion was occasionally permitted as a tool of assimilation when elimination wasn't immediately practical. Here's what happened to many of those children. They grew up Turkish or Kurdish. They raised their own children in those identities. Their grandchildren and great-grandchildren lived their entire lives not knowing. And then, in the last few decades, some of them started finding out. Old family photos with unfamiliar writing, grandmothers who prayed in a language no one recognized, deathbed confessions, DNA tests. There are people alive today in Turkey and Kurdish communities who are discovering that they are Armenian, that their great-grandparents were taken, that the identity they were raised in was built on an erasure that was deliberate and systematic. One man, after discovering his Armenian roots, said he decided to learn more about his heritage in eastern Turkey, what had been his family's ancestral homeland. Another discovered his origins in old family photographs and, raised as a Muslim his entire life, began the process of converting to Christianity. One Turkish man ended his life after discovering he was actually Armenian. Others are conflicted about what it all means for them now. The genocide did not just kill people, it stole the identities of the people it didn't kill, and that theft is still being uncovered now, more than 100 years later. Turkey has never recognized the Armenian genocide. The denial is not passive. It is not simply the absence of acknowledgement. It is active, it is state-sponsored, it is enforced legally. In Turkey, calling the Armenian genocide a genocide has been prosecuted under a law against insulting Turkishness. Scholars, journalists, and novelists have faced legal action and even death for naming it accurately. The denial machinery argues that what happened was not genocide, that it was wartime relocation, that Armenians were a threat, that the deaths were mutual, that the numbers are exaggerated, that the archives don't support the conclusion. But the archives do support the conclusion. The documentation is extensive, from Ottoman military records, from German and American diplomatic dispatches, from missionary accounts, from survivor testimony, from the post-war Ottoman military tribunals that the Ottoman government itself held, which produced convictions for the architects of the genocide before Turkey's political situation changed and the prosecutions stopped. Here's the argument that genocide scholars make. Denial is not separate from genocide, it's the final stage of it. Because the goal of genocide is not just to kill people, it is to erase them, to eliminate not just their physical existence, but their historical existence as well, to make it as though they were never there, did not matter, and were not destroyed. Denial completes that work. Every year that Turkey denies the genocide, it extends the harm to the descendants of survivors who are told by a state officially with legal enforcement that what happened to their families did not happen, that their grief has no legitimate object, that their history is a lie. And the consequences of that denial reached further than Armenia. In August 1939, 8 days before the German invasion of Poland, Adolf Hitler reportedly addressed his commanding generals and asked, "Who, after all, speaks today of the annihilation of the Armenians?" Some historians debate whether he said those exact words. The document containing the quote is disputed, but what is not disputed is the underlying logic he was applying. There is substantial scholarly evidence that the Nazi worldview was shaped in part by the Turkish example, specifically by the fact that the architects faced no meaningful international consequence. The leaders of the genocide were convicted in absentia by Ottoman tribunals and then largely escaped justice. Talat Pasha was assassinated in Berlin in 1921 by an Armenian survivor, Soghomon Tehlirian, in an act of personal justice. But as a state, as a system, no one was held to account. And 30 years after the first genocide of the 20th century, the second one began. 1.5 million people, women who were violated, then asked to raise their violators as children and pretend they were someone else. Children who were given new names and new religions and told to forget. A people scattered across the world whose descendants are still fighting for the simple acknowledgement that it happened. And a nation, Armenia, that is still here, still Christian, still speaking the language that Mesrop Mashtots built an alphabet to protect, still observing April 24th every year. Raphael Lemkin, the Polish-born Jewish lawyer who invented the word genocide in 1944, modeled his definition in part on what happened to the Armenians and members of his own family in the Holocaust. He understood that what had been done to them needed a name, that unnamed things are easier to repeat. He was right. We name it, we remember it, not because remembering brings the dead back, but because the alternative, forgetting, denying, looking away, has a cost that history has already shown us we cannot afford to pay. Remember the Armenians. This is the final episode for now of this series on the history of faith in Armenia. If you haven't seen the earlier videos in this series, the playlist is linked in the description. Subscribe so you're there for the next series starting soon about the Vori, aka Thieves in Law, the stories that started me down this path. Thanks a bunch. Peace.